if all these things are true, and according to our presupposition they are, then the only consistently Christian way to argue is from the impossibility of the contrary. That is to say, without the Christian God's existence, no one can know anything at all. In other words, to deny the existence of God is to deny the very precondition for all intelligibility. To put it positively, because God does exist, meaning and knowledge are possible. If God doesn't exist, then we lose all ability to make any judgments whatsoever, or the ability to justify any belief whatsoever. Only because God does exist can we make sense of the way the world is. The Christian's job is to press the unbeliever to make sense out of the world given his espoused presuppositions. We must demonstrate that the unbeliever does not have grounds to believe in laws of logic, or the dignity of man, or moral absolutes, among many other things. The Christian worldview alone gives the grounds for justification of these things. Indeed, it is true the unbeliever employs these principles within his own worldview, but they don't belong within his worldview, and he cannot account for them given his presuppositions. Van Til and Bahnsen argue that there is a two-step process in our apologetical method. The scriptures they would use are most often was Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. It says this, answer the fool according to his folly. Answer not the fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself. Answer the fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Apologetically concerned, this means that we should not argue from the espoused presuppositions of the unbeliever, namely autonomous reasoning not subjected to Christ at the outset. This is because according to this verse, we will end up like him. In other words, suspending our presuppositions for the sake of argument and adopting his will lead us to the unbeliever's conclusions. This is because his presuppositions preclude elements that would be necessary for the Christian worldview to be true. We would never get out of the pit of unbelief and would end up with the conclusions just like the fool. On the other hand, believers must answer the fool according to his folly. In other words, they must place themselves within the worldview of the unbeliever, all the while maintaining their own presuppositions and demonstrate that his presuppositions cannot account for the way that the world really is. We must show him that his worldview does not have the necessary elements to provide him with the justification of his beliefs. In the end, we must uproot his pride and self-sufficiency, lest he be wise in his own eyes. When reasoning with the unbeliever, Christians must argue in such a way that they do not call into question God's existence from the outset of their argument, which those who assume neutral ground with the unbeliever usually do. And we must not construct arguments that leave us with probable conclusions regarding God's existence, as well as obscure notions as to which God it is that actually exists, such as the teleological or cosmological argument. None of those necessitate the Christian God. Let me give you one quick argument, is that right? Is that right? Okay. Is it? Oh, good. Oh, goodness. Okay. A quick way to say this. I didn't get to say this in the last class. The argument that I would usually help to explain this is this. If two people are debating over whether logic exists, the person who believes in logic, how is he going to argue against the person who doesn't believe in logic? Okay, the moment that you begin to argue about it, the man who's arguing against logic is in some sense employing logic. So therefore, he's actually giving credit to the other position. Okay? The person who believes in logic, but the other guy's denying it, the way in which you'd argue with him is to say, if you deny my position, then you ultimately reduce yourself to some sort of absurdity. You can't even prove your position unless my position is true. That's what I'm saying about the transcendental argument. Because God does exist and we live in his world, the moment that you reject him is the moment that you undercut all ability to justify anything whatsoever. All right. Let me just hurry up here and I'll just get to really quickly to the last point. It is at this point that I want to address the differences between Van Til and Frame. The reason why I didn't spend a lot of time on this is because I really like Frame a lot. I didn't want to rail him too much. Ultimately, it is summarized by saying that Frame up front argues that we should have a distinctively Christian method of apologetics. But when it actually comes to constructing arguments, he says we can have arguments that are not distinctively Christian, and that they are not articulated in such a way that they presuppose the Christian worldview. He does that by adopting ones like teleological or cosmological argument. Frame does a great job railing against topics like autonomous reasoning and neutral ground, but then he accepts the traditional arguments as they are originally constructed, although sometimes he does recast them transcendentally. According to Frame, he does this only because the only reason those who use the traditional approach to apologetics come to the conclusions they do after constructing their arguments, such as the teleological or cosmological arguments, is because throughout the argument they presuppose or are committed to the Christian worldview. With this I agree, but that does not entail that the arguments themselves are justified, nor does it address the inherent deficiency of the arguments as far as their conclusions being probable, and the problem that when the arguments are finished, it could have been an alien that actually created and not the God of the Bible. So ultimately, and in a debate between Frame and Bahnsen actually brought the question back to ethics. He says it's simply an ethical issue of how we're going to argue for the existence of God. It gets much deeper than that, and there's lots of materials if you're interested in the debate that can go a little bit deeper. But let me just close out by saying this. Inherent within the formulation of the transcendental argument is the necessity that it is the Christian God who makes sense of the world we live in. I'm trying to anticipate some possible arguments here. Of course, I would be charged with being arbitrary. I could be charged with being arbitrary for positing the Christian God and not other gods. But I say that my claim of the Christian God's necessity for predication is like the claim that only the Christian God saves. Our presupposition tells us that this is true, and we have no right to call it into question. Of course, we can explain that it is only the personal triune God who can explain such concepts as the one and the many, the uniformity of nature, and explain the problem with man as a sinner and what God has done to remedy the situation. In these senses, and many more, only the Christian worldview can account for the way that the world really is. I would say that it's not arbitrary simply because, as I said before, everyone must begin somewhere, and for the Christian, it is the self-attesting Word of God.